It was the evening of April 3rd, 1968, and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had just returned to Memphis. For over a year, as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he had been planning the Poor People's Campaign, an attempted expansion of the civil rights movement that would include economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. In Memphis, that struggle was on display. King planned to march with 1,300 mostly black sanitation workers who had gone on strike in February seeking union recognition, dues checkoff, and an increase to their $1.65 to $2.10 an hour wage. Working conditions were hideous. The walkout had been precipitated by the deaths of 2 workers who had been crushed to death inside their own garbage truck. When King took the pulpit of the Bishop Charles Mason Temple on April 3rd, he sought to rally his supporters for a peaceful march, then scheduled for April 9th. He warned against the violence that had marred a previous protest, lest violence overshadow the justice of the union's cause. Nearing the close of his address, he recurred to his vision of the Promised Land and of the peace that vision had brought him. This was not the first time King had prophesied his own death, but it would be the last. Less than 24 hours later, at around 6 p.m. on April 4th, King was shot dead on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel where he was staying. Memphis Night editor Doug Stone filed this urgent after confirmation from the police. Nobel laureate Martin Luther King Jr., father of nonviolence in the American Civil Rights Movement, was killed by an assassin's bullet Thursday night. King, 39, was hit in the neck by a bullet as he stood on the balcony of a hotel here. He died less than an hour later in St. Joseph Hospital. The Reverend Jesse Jackson said he and others in the King party were getting ready to go to dinner when the shooting occurred. King was on the second-floor balcony of the motel, Jackson said. He had just bent over. If he had been standing up, he wouldn't have been hit in the face. A shot then rang out. Jackson said the only sound King uttered after that was, "Oh." In Atlanta, Coretta Scott King learned of her husband's death as she waited for a flight to Memphis. Immediately, 2 police cars escorted her home, where she went into seclusion, receiving only family and close friends. Among them was AP reporter Katherine Johnson. A native of Columbus, Georgia, Johnson had been covering the King family since their return from Montgomery to Atlanta in 1960, when King took up the post of assistant pastor at his father's Ebenezer Baptist Church. The only female reporter in the Atlanta bureau, Johnson provided feature stories on Mrs. King for the State Wire. And while King himself was still a relative unknown in his hometown, Johnson began marching alongside him to report his activities, a beat she quickly carved out for herself. Her first-hand view of King, when she was often the only white person present to interview him, gave her special insight into the movement he led. In a 2007 oral history interview, she recalled the night King died.
When King was shot, I was with the date, and we were headed for a movie, and listened to the news, because everything was so hot then, you listened to the news wherever you were going. And we heard that King was shot. Well, we were just stunned, and he turned around the car and went to the King house. And it was pouring down rain on the night he was shot. And I went out in the rain, went onto the porch, and there were a couple of reporters, including a New York Times guy that I knew, and the police officer, and he said, no one is allowed inside, no reporters. And so the door opened and let somebody out, and Coretta was at the end of the hall, and she was recovering from major surgery then, and she was had on a long rose pink robe and a nightgown. And she said, she spotted me, and she said, let Katherine in. So the officer let me in. I was the only one that got in. And she said she was going to go she was going to lie down.
Johnson was the only reporter with Coretta Scott King from the assassination of her husband to his burial. On April 9th, at 10:30 in the morning, King's funeral began with a 3-hour service at Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was attended by close family, friends, colleagues of King, and members of the congregation. Following the Mass, Johnson hopped onto the roof of King's waiting hearse to get a better view of the dignitaries as they emerged. A silent procession of over 100,000 people formed to accompany King's casket as it was borne by 2 mules on a wooden farm wagon down Auburn Avenue to the gravesite at Morehouse College. It was then that it hit Johnson how transforming an experience it had been covering Martin Luther King.
When I grew up, as I said, we had a nurse whom we loved dearly, and we had a yard man, and we played with his 2 children. He would bring twin sons when they were growing up. But I did not know any other blacks except, his servants. And Dr. King really was so brilliant. My sense of justice and humanity was really aroused. It was aroused by covering the movement.
The assassination of Martin Luther King sparked the greatest wave of social unrest since the Civil War. Riots, demonstrations, window breaking, and the torching of buildings broke out in more than 100 U.S. cities, killing 35 and injuring more than 2,500. Democratic primary contender Senator Robert F. Kennedy had just landed in Indianapolis for a campaign rally in the heart of the African-American ghetto when he got word of King's death. Although his aides sought to shield him from potential violence, Kennedy insisted he keep his commitment and inform the crowd. Irwin J. Miller of the Indianapolis Bureau and Joseph E. Mobat, traveling with Kennedy, covered his 2-minute address. Many sobbed and cried openly in disbelief as Kennedy spoke. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another, Kennedy said. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend, and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love.
That train is coming round that curve. That gospel train is coming low, coming round that curve. That train is over, shoot, shout, shout, shout. That bell is over, ding dong, and the whistle says, my mother gonna ride that train, coming round.